Okay, so today let's dive into something I think we've all been kind of thinking about lately, addiction. We
Right.
all know it's kind of a big deal, and it's something that people talk about often in hushed tones,
Hmm.
or they reduce it to something simplistic.
Yeah.
But you brought in some excerpts from The Captive Imagination by psychiatrist Elias Dakwar.
Yes.
And I gotta say, his take on addiction is anything but simplistic.
It really is a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
You see, Dakwar, he spent years treating patients with addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and he started to see beyond those common narratives we hear.
So it's not just about willpower
Right.
or like bad choices then.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Dakwar argues that addiction is way more complex than that.
Okay.
He says it's this really intense interplay between our imagination,
Mm-hmm.
the stories we tell ourselves, and this deep human need to find relief from suffering.
Okay.
And he even uses this phrase, confusion between noumena and phenomena.
Whoa. Okay. You're going to have to break that one down for me.
Okay.
Noumena and what was the second one?
Phenomena.
Phenomena.
Yeah. It sounds really complicated, but it's actually a pretty simple idea.
Okay.
Noumena are basically our own internal interpretations of the world,
Okay.
our subjective experiences.
Mhm.
Phenomena are the actual objective things happening around us.
Okay. So how does that relate to addiction though?
So imagine someone who is struggling with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
They might start to see their cravings, their need for a substance, as this objective truth
Okay.
about themselves and the world.
Like it's just a fact.
Like it's just a fact.
Yeah.
That they can't control a reality they can't escape.
So it's kind of like how Don Quixote, after reading all those knightly tales,
Yes.
started to see windmills as giants.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
He let his imagination warp his perception of reality.
Exactly. And Dakwar actually talks about Don Quixote.
Wow.
He says that addiction is kind of like that.
Okay.
We get so caught up in the story we are telling ourselves about this substance, about our need for it, that we lose sight of what's actually real.
Okay.
And the more we buy into that story, the stronger it becomes.
So to be clear, though, Dakwar's not saying that addiction isn't real, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
He's just saying it's more nuanced than we often give it credit for.
Okay.
Take Ahmed, for example.
Sure.
He was one of Dakwar's patients
Okay.
who struggled with heroin addiction. And even after his physical dependence was managed through medication, he still felt trapped.
Wow.
He wanted to break free,
Yeah.
but the addiction itself had become a barrier.
So it's like the addiction takes on a life of its own, in a way.
Precisely. And that's one of the reasons why Dakwar really challenges that traditional brain disease model of addiction.
And we'll definitely come back to that. But before we do, you mentioned that Dakwar doesn't even see addiction as being as widespread as people think.
Yeah, he makes a really interesting point about that.
Okay.
Only about 3.9% of the U.S. population
Yeah.
actually experiences drug addiction,
That's it.
according to Dakwar.
Wow.
Most people who use addictive substances don't become addicted.
Interesting.
It's not simply about using a substance.
Okay.
It's about the relationship with that substance.
Mm-hmm.
The story we tell ourselves about why we need it, that really matters.
That's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah.
It's not just the substance itself.
Right.
It's the meaning and the narrative that we attach to it.
Yeah.
It seems like Dakwar is really trying to reframe how we even think about addiction at like a fundamental level.
He is.
But he also dives into the science of it all, right?
Right.
Specifically that brain disease model we were just talking about. So you mentioned the brain disease model of addiction.
Right.
I have to admit, that's kind of how I've always thought about it.
Yeah.
It's a disease like any other, right?
Yeah. That's definitely the prevailing view.
Okay.
And it makes sense why people find it appealing.
Yeah.
To put it simply, the brain disease model says that addiction is a chronic relapsing condition caused by changes in how the brain is wired and how it functions. Basically, prolonged substance use is thought to hijack the brain's reward system,
Okay.
making you crave the substance and lose control over your use.
So it's like those reward pathways in your brain get stuck on overdrive.
Yeah.
And they're just like screaming for more, even if you know consciously that it's bad for you.
Exactly, and I think that's why this model has been really helpful for some people.
Yeah.
It removes some of the blame and shame that often surrounds addiction.
Right. It's not a moral failing.
Right.
It's a medical condition.
Exactly, and Dakwar acknowledges this too.
Okay.
He talks about a patient, Steve, whose family really struggled to understand why he couldn't just stop using opioids.
Right.
And framing it as a disease help them move past the blame
Okay.
and start working towards solutions together.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
But Dakwar also seems to have some reservations about the brain disease model.
he does.
He suggests that maybe it's a little too simplistic.
Right.
You know?
Dakwar points out that while it's definitely useful for understanding the neurological aspects of addiction,
Okay.
the brain disease model doesn't tell the whole story.
Okay.
He argues that focusing solely on the brain kind of ignores these other critical dimensions of addiction,
Okay.
like the social, the moral, and even the existential aspects.
So it's not just about brain chemistry.
Right.
It's not just about neurons firing.
Exactly. Think of it this way.
Okay.
We can study the brain all we want,
Mm-hmm.
but can we truly capture the feeling of craving a substance just by looking at a brain scan?
Right?
Can we see the thoughts, the emotions, the years of experiences
Yeah.
that contributed to that craving just by looking at a brain scan?
That's a really good point. It's like trying to understand the beauty of a painting
Yes.
just by like analyzing the chemical composition of the paint.
Exactly.
You're kind of missing the bigger picture.
We're missing a lot.
Right.
And Dakwar even takes it a step further.
Yeah.
He argues that even scientific research on addiction isn't immune to bias.
Wait, really you mean science can be biased?
Well, of course, scientists, they strive for objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
but even they are influenced by the prevailing thinking of the time.
Okay.
Dakwar uses the example of studies that focus on brain activity in addicts,
Okay.
pointing out that similar patterns of brain activation are seen in people engrossed in other activities,
What?
like enjoying a delicious meal or getting lost in a work project.
Oh, wow.
So it's not necessarily that the research is wrong.
Okay.
It's just that the researchers might be looking for specific results
Right.
that confirm what they already believe.
That's fascinating and a little unsettling.
Yeah.
So if it's not just about the brain, what other factors are at play here?
Right.
What's Dakwar's perspective on that? So if addiction isn't just a brain disease
Okay.
and science itself can be biased,
Right.
where does that leave us?
Yeah.
How else are we supposed to understand what's really going on?
Well, that's where Dakwar's ideas about perception and belief come in.
Okay.
Remember those fictions we were talking about?
Yeah.
He says those play a huge role in addiction.
Okay.
He actually compares these fictions to a knife through the heart.
Okay. That sounds intense. What does he mean by that?
It's all about how the stories we tell ourselves, especially about our suffering, can actually make that suffering feel even more real
Okay.
and even more inescapable.
Mm-hmm.
He uses this example of a patient named Fred who used alcohol to cope with his problems.
Don't a lot of people use alcohol that way, though?
Sure, but
Yeah.
it wasn't just that Fred drank, it's how he thought about his drinking.
Okay.
He had convinced himself that his problems were just who he was.
Okay.
Just an unavoidable part of his life, and alcohol.
Yeah.
That was the only solution.
Wow.
It was like he had written this whole story in his head where he was a tragic hero,
Okay.
and alcohol was both the villain and the only comfort he could find.
Wow. So it's like he's trapped in this loop.
Exactly.
The more he drinks, the more he believes this story about himself,
Yeah.
and the worse he feels.
Exactly. And that's where Dakwar brings in this idea of the placebo response.
Okay.
We've all heard about the placebo effect, right?
Yeah, like when someone takes a sugar pill,
Right.
thinking it's medicine, and then they feel better.
Exactly. Because they believe it's going to work.
Yeah.
Right. And that belief is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
Dakwar says addiction works in a similar way, but in reverse.
Okay.
Instead of believing a harmless thing will help you,
Yeah.
you believe this potentially harmful thing is indispensable.
Wow.
You're so convinced that you need this substance that your belief becomes its own kind of reality.
That's really interesting. So if addiction thrives on these distorted realities, these fictions, like he calls them,
Right.
then disrupting those fictions must be a key part of breaking free.
Absolutely.
So how does Dakwar approach that? Does he offer any solutions?
He does. He talks about how approaches like AA, while not a cure-all,
Sure.
can be really helpful in helping people kind of deconstruct those harmful narratives.
Mm.
It's about recognizing those negative stories you tell yourself and consciously replacing them with stories that support real change.
So it's like rewriting the script of your life, so to speak.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's about taking control of the narrative.
Okay.
And Dakwar even explores some pretty unconventional approaches too.
Like what?
For instance, he discusses his work using ketamine in a therapeutic setting.
Ketamine as in the anesthetic.
The very same.
Wow.
Though in this context, it's used in a carefully controlled environment and always with the guidance of a medical professional.
Of course, yeah.
Dakwar really emphasizes that mindset and setting are crucial here.
Okay.
One patient, Marcus, described his ketamine experience as this incredible silence,
Yeah.
a break from the constant noise of his addiction.
Wow.
It gave him this fresh perspective, a chance to really see himself and his life differently.
So the ketamine, in a way, helped him disrupt that old destructive story he was telling himself.
Exactly.
And allowed for something new to emerge.
Exactly. And that's what Dakwar wants us to consider.
Okay.
If addiction means becoming captive to our own limiting narratives, what are the stories we're telling ourselves that are holding us back in other areas of our lives?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Yeah, what fictions are we clinging to that keep us from fully experiencing the world and ourselves?
Right.
Wow. Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
Thank you so much for bringing this book to our attention.
Of course.
And for taking us through it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.